Welcome again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who wants to hone their skills at critically thinking about the public health literature. I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health, and we are here today in the Boston University Godley studio. Today in our first segment, our Journal Club segment, we are going to dive into a paper that reviews the evidence around artificial sweeteners and impacts on cardiometabolic health. In the second part of the podcast, our deep dive segment, we will talk about how conflicts of interest affect how we judge a study. And then in our third segment, our amazing and amusing, Don, that is what it's called, we'll talk about things that blew our minds or just made us act like fifth graders. And before we get started, we want to take a second to remind you about Population Health Exchange, Boston University School of Public Health's resource hub for lifelong learning. Find out more at www.populationhealthexchange.org, where you'll find this podcast, as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. Now, let me introduce you to the group. I am joined today by Dr. Chris Gill. Chris.
Hi. Good afternoon, Matt. How are you?
Who are you?
I'm a associate professor, here at the Department of Global Health at the School of Public Health, and I'm an infectious disease guy by training.
Excellent. And Dr. Don Thea. Don.
And I'm just an older version of Chris.
How much older?
And improved.
Professor of global health at Boston University School of Public Health, also an infectious disease doctor.
Excellent. All right, let's get into our first segment. So we are taking on a new paper that's been widely covered that reviews the evidence on something we all care deeply about, the relationship between artificial sweeteners and cardiometabolic health. So for anyone who doesn't know, artificial sweeteners are these widely used products that people use to ruin coffee. And this was an article published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. How's it going, eh? And it's entitled Non-Nutritive Sweeteners and Cardiometabolic Health, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis of Randomized Controlled Trials and Prospective Cohort Studies. So before we get started, let me give you a couple of the headlines. So NPR says, artificial sweeteners don't help people lose weight, review finds. And then my two favorite ones from the Mirror, Diet Coke could be making you fat. Fat in all caps. Artificial sweeteners linked to risk of weight gain. And Fortune says, artificial sweeteners won't help you lose weight, according to a sad but important study. So before we get into it, Chris, why don't you explain to everyone what this study was about and what they did?
Oh, gosh. Well, sure. If I can digress before we regress, this study had a particular resonance for me because it hit one of these.
You use artificial sweeteners all the time?
No, but I had a summer of artificial sweeteners back in college.
Didn't we all?
I was subletting an apartment, and one of the guys I was subletting with, whose name was Peters something or other, his girlfriend was the daughter of a vice president of NutraSweet.
Oh boy!
And he had given her, a box, sort of like a 2.5 foot by 3 foot crate filled with those NutraSweet gumballs that were sent out to everybody in the United States when they were launching NutraSweet, aspartame, for those who are not aware.
Yep.
And so we had some 50,000 gumballs in little individually wrapped plastic things. And we attempted to eat them all over that summer. We didn't make a dent in that box, but by the end of it, we were so sick of aspartame and NutraSweet. And it's like the whole apartment was covered by little wabs up of multicolored gum stuck to everything.
And you didn't grow any additional appendages or anything?
It was horrible. No. And so it is also like a dose toxicity study, like a phase 1 clinical trial, small number of adult volunteers, overdosing on aspartame over the summer. We live to tell the tale. Anyway.
Have you had any since?
I'm sad to say that I have acquired a very keen ability to identify aspartame in almost microscopic doses. I can spot it immediately because the taste is so aversive to me. I just don't like it now. And anyway.
Is there a conflict of interest here having Chris
review this paper? There may in
Who
fact
does not
be.
like aspartame.
To be clear, we're half an hour into the podcast and you haven't told us what it's about yet.
So this is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a discipline in clinical epidemiology around which there are many complicated courses that you can take, including at the School of Public Health, which are very excellent, by the way.
Mike LaValle.
Mike LaValle, a very excellent professor and friend of ours. However, for those who are not really familiar with the meta-analysis, it is a highfalutin term for taking the average of stuff.
The average of what?
Of a lot of stuff.
Several different studies. And
on the same topic.
On the same topic, right. So You might have like 50 studies on aspirin and whether it prevents strokes, but they're all done with like 25 people. And so none of them individually has enough statistical oomph because the sample size and event rate is so low that you can never really tell whether it worked. But by lumping them all together, you can kind of pretend this was one giant study. But the difficulty is that often these little component studies that you try to lump together are not that similar. And so the ability to lump is complicated by the heterogeneity, the differences in the studies that make them unlumpable on some level.
Unlumpable, I believe, is a term that my parents used for me when I was a kid.
So this is a study which is a meta-analysis looking at the effect of consumption of sugar substitute through meta-analytic techniques, and they're looking to see whether this affects a whole range of clinical outcomes, such as body mass index, or whether you're more likely to get diabetes or weight change. And they had to lump in two different groups because some of the studies that they found in this meta-analysis were randomized controlled trials.
Which we like.
Which we like. We tend to think that they're less susceptible to bias and the issues of causality are more clear, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was a much larger number of observational studies, i.e. cohort studies.
Which we always we like as well when they're done well.
And so this article actually gives us a chance to throw, to take pot shots at two of our favorite problems, our villains in clinical epidemiology, which are bias and causality, all in one go. Now, without even looking at the results of the study, you might say that the results from the randomized controlled trials lumped together would be a little more persuasive than the observational studies lumped together. Mm-hmm. And they kind of acknowledge this, but they also point to a previous meta-analysis that had been published 2 years ago where they did exactly the same thing. They had a bunch of randomized controlled trials and a bunch of observational studies, and they lumped them. And the randomized controlled trials found that on average, when you had sugar substitutes and therefore were not having as much sugar in your diet in an experimental setting, that people tended to lose a little bit of weight.
Mm-hmm. Not much,
but they lost weight. Whereas in the observational group, the observational studies, the exact opposite effect was seen, that they tended to gain weight, which I hate to say is what Donald Trump is gunning at, which is this issue of why were they using sugar substitutes in the first place, which is probably because they were trying to lose weight because they were gaining weight.
Yep.
And so the use of aspartame would not necessarily be the cause of loss of weight, gain of weight, so much as the reason that you were using aspartame. So it's reverse causality.
So to be clear, you were not endorsing Donald Trump's opinion so much as you were getting at the idea that we have this confounding problem that when we look at observational studies of people who use sugar substitutes, there are reasons that they do that relate to weight gain that aren't necessarily just randomly distributed in the population. They are specific to people who are trying to lose weight or change weight.
And that's called confounding.
Confounding.
Right.
Yep.
It's a great example of it. So these guys decided to repeat the meta-analysis the other guys had done, pointing to the fact that when they were searching for the studies to include and therefore lump together, that they maybe use a set of search criteria for their strategy for searching for papers on online databases that would have eliminated their ability to find some key critical studies. And also that several published papers had been published subsequently, which could, add more oomph.
Statistical oomph, something that we teach our students about.
Like 100,000 more subjects.
So they redid this analysis.
Yeah. Yep.
They redid this analysis, and basically what they found after looking at the RCTs and the epi studies,
randomized controlled trials,
and the observational epi studies separately, was that in the randomized controlled trials, they slightly lost weight or maybe didn't gain any weight, but the effect was close to zero, but trending towards lost a little bit of weight, i.e. exactly what the other guys had found. Whereas with the observational studies, they tended to gain a little bit of weight. In fact, quite significantly, they gained weight. Exactly like the other meta-analysis had found. And so even though these two meta-analyses were sort of like done, one was done to replicate and correct the errors of the first one, in fact, they found exactly the same thing. But their interpretation, the spin on this, was where it differs, because in the current paper, they say, well, sometimes randomized controlled trials don't agree with observational studies, full stop. Not saying because observational studies are prone to bias and reverse causality.
Let's come back to that.
Because there are maybe the RCTs are just wrong. I know. I'm just saying.
There are other reasons.
But it was a very curious statement in my view.
Okay.
So basically, that's what they found.
All right. So we have essentially a meta-analysis, a review of studies that puts the data from all the different studies that have been done together, tries to give us a summary of the evidence. And what they found was the trials found a benefit, slight benefit in terms of weight loss, but not much in terms of
maybe no effect.
Possibly no effect, but at most a little bit of a benefit in terms of weight loss. And the observational studies showed some harm. And we got to sort that one out. All right, Don, give us your take on this study. What's your assessment?
I think that there's a number of really interesting aspects to this study. For one, I had difficulty with doing a meta-analysis on a series of RCTs and a series of observational studies. Because I think that's mixing apples and oranges, and then even within the oranges, it's mixing navel oranges with kumquat oranges, or
really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Because
that's the best you could come up with for another kind of orange.
Valencia,
Clementine. There you go.
Clementine comes to mind.
Yes.
Where do you shop?
Amazon.
Okay, that makes sense.
So as far as the RCTs are concerned, they were mixing a whole bunch of RCTs that were being done for different circumstances. Like some of them were to look at hypertension, some of them were to look at obesity or diabetes. And I think it's really not fair to be able to try to throw all those different kinds of RCTs into one meta-analysis. And I think the same thing is true for the observational studies. In their abstract, they say observational data suggests that routine intake of non-nutritive sweeteners may be associated with increased BMI and cardiometabolic risk. I think they could just as easily say observational data suggests that increased BMI and cardiometabolic risk may be associated with routine intake of non-nutritive sweeteners, which is sort of what Chris was saying.
Reverse causality.
Reverse causality. There were a couple of other things that I thought were interesting. They buried what I liked about it is they made an attempt to put in place some quality measures. So they tried to assess in a systematic way the quality of the individual studies, and they used some fancy meta-analysis techniques. I don't know that they were convincing in terms of allaying my concerns about the heterogeneity or the quality of the underlying studies. But there was a real kicker in there, and the kicker was
There's a big kicker
that those studies that were sponsored by industry did show an effect on decreasing weight loss in comparison to those who were
they lost more weight.
They lost more weight versus those that were not sponsored by industry. So that is an immediate red flag in my mind, and immediately raises the question of conflict of interest.
Seems suspicious. I agree.
Which we will get into in detail, but I agree with you. That certainly threw up some red flags for me. So let me ask you guys this question, because Chris, you have this seemingly aversion to observational studies, particularly when compared to randomized trials, and in this case, I think you have some reason to be. By the way, let me give my take. By the way, which is I think this is a pretty well designed meta-analysis. I think for what they were trying to do, I think they did a really nice job of it. Minus, I have some quibbling with their conclusions in the same way that Chris did, because I do think that we have this problem of potentially the reverse. I don't know if it's reverse causality or if it's confounding so much as it's, we know that people do things for reasons that are associated with other behaviors and outcomes, and that makes it harder to see cause and effect when it's truly there. But I also am never clear when we're looking at observational studies versus randomized trials, what question the studies are answering. It seems to me that the observational study, which is where the majority of this evidence comes from, looks at the effect of what happens when you're taking these substances all the time, or you're taking them never, or you're using them for whatever. No idea what that means. Does that mean I'm taking them in substitute for sugary substances? Am I taking them in addition to sugary substances? Am I substituting, calories one for another? Am I keeping the calorie count the same? I have no idea. With a randomized trial, I at least know what they intended to do, because the randomized trial has a protocol where we tell people, I want you to do this and stop doing that. Doesn't mean people follow it necessarily, but at least I know what the question is.
There's going to be an average higher exposure to one than on average in the other.
And I don't know what they're doing here.
But the trouble with dietary studies is that you really can't plan to have a randomized controlled trial exist for a long enough period of time to really be able to see the outcomes of interest. 6 months or 9 months just really isn't enough time to adequately be able to address the question of weight loss over an important period of time, and the intake of these substances.
Okay, but and that's a really good point. Is it does it imply that there's nothing meaningful that we can learn from dietary studies? In other words, I mean, if I think about, I always want to turn this into public health messaging. If we're doing these studies, presumably we're doing it because we care about improving people's health. What's the message, say, from if you believe these trials actually showed some benefit? Is the message everybody should start using aspartame? Should I use it all the time? You should use it for everything? Should I, I don't know exactly what the message is, and I don't know, is telling people to do that going to improve their health over a lifetime, or is it just going to improve weight loss over 6 months and then it's going to go back to normal? I'm unclear on what the actual question is.
I mean, I think it suffers from some of the same problems that most weight loss or dietary studies suffer, and that is that even if you are able to, under experimental conditions that are very, very controlled, show that a particular intervention decreases, promotes weight loss, the real question is that weight loss going to persist, and is it going to have a meaningful effect on an individual's health status? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there's another way of looking at this too, which was what was the average effect size that they're measuring here, and I think this gets to your question of like what is the clinical relevance? Because with a meta-analysis and you get more statistical oomph, it means you can find smaller and smaller differences. Yep. But in the absolute differences that they report here, they're really small. I mean, for example, with a change in the BMI in the randomized controlled trial meta-analysis, the difference was 0.37 points on the BMI scale. So between a 23 and a 23.3. So sort of objectively, these are identical, almost identical. I mean, they're not statistically identical, but clinically, the difference between 23 and 23.3 is not important.
So I absolutely agree with what you just said, except that people do often remind me that small differences mean probably very little to the individual. But on a population level, if we could bring the BMI down by, X amount, it would have some population level impact. But I take your point, and I think you're right. The second issue that I take with trying to interpret a study like this is, again, and if you assume that you believe the results, which we have reason to believe may be questionable, particularly for the observational studies, is who is this for? Does this tell us that if you already have an elevated BMI, that you should use this to reduce, to control weight? Does it apply to everyone, that everyone should suddenly, if you have a normal BMI, should I still start taking aspartame instead of sugar in my coffee? Shouldn't have either, by the way.
I think it's completely unclear, and in part
unclear.
It's completely unclear because of the heterogeneity of the studies that went into this meta-analysis, because they were completely diverse populations. There were some obese, there were some not obese. The observational studies seem to all start out with a particular BMI, but again, they were for different purposes. So I think that coming to those conclusions is problematic.
No, I agree. Okay, so taking it all on balance. So now you've got a pool of observational studies that seem to show some harm, not massive harm, but some harm in terms of BMI, and randomized trials which showed possibly some benefit, maybe not. But given the concerns that we have around the confounding problems, around the reverse causality, around all those interpretations of what the results actually mean, where do you fall on this? Should we be encouraging people to use artificial sweeteners?
Well, my take home from this is that if you're looking for the bottom line message, the choice of whether to use sugar substitutes or not is almost irrelevant. That it doesn't have it's like the worst case scenario is that the observational trials are correct, in which case the BMI rose by 0.05. which is like almost nothing. And the best case scenario is that the RCTs are right, in which case it has a trivial effect on weight loss.
Yeah.
So it might be slightly helpful, but if it's harmful, it's barely harmful.
Okay.
So
although it
probably doesn't matter at all, is what I took away from this.
Yeah.
For weight loss. But I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned is that they looked at some of the other cardiometabolic outcomes, like the development of diabetes, and buried in the results are that they found a 14% increase in the development of diabetes among people who actually did not use in the control group in comparison to the intervention group. And when they...
Sorry, hang on. You're telling me that it's worse or better to use artificial sweeteners in terms of diabetes?
Worse.
It's worse.
If I use artificial sweeteners, I'm more likely to develop diabetes.
Right. The relative risk was 1.14.
Yeah. And that's from the observational studies?
Yes, because they didn't have any sufficient long-term follow-up.
But they did a fancy calculation where they determined what the publication bias is.
What is publication bias?
In which case, they take into consideration all the studies that weren't published that that showed no effect, and when they threw that into their analysis, the risk ratio came down considerably. In fact, I think it became non-significant. So even those findings, I think, are a little bit questionable if you take a step back and you look at kind of the totality of how these studies were done. No,
I would agree with you. I think there's no question that you've got to take both the trials and the observational studies with a grain of salt. For the trials, there's just this blaring concern about conflict of interest that we'll talk about in a minute in our second segment. And then with the observational studies, there's just this potential for bias that hangs around. Now, we didn't specifically go into the details, but they do list for each of the studies what they were able to control for. And the thing that really sort of stands out for me is, most of these studies were actually able to adjust for age, sex, and BMI. So they account for that, but nothing for body composition, very limited amount of data for amount of sugar consumed. So a lot of things that you'd want to know about to be able to get at causation in an observational study. So my take is pretty similar to Chris's. I mean, I think they have done the best that they could with the data that they had in hand, but I do think that there are some serious limitations to this data. And my take-home message is I'm not too concerned. I'm not real concerned that there's much of a harmful effect. I'm not convinced at all that there's much of a beneficial effect. And unless I see more convincing data, I'd say, probably not much going on.
It's a giant shoulder shrug.
Yeah.
Meh.
Yeah.
There's an interesting...
Is there a scale of meh?
Yeah, this is an 11 on the meh scale.
This is a meh.
There's an interesting spin on this too. If we're going to go into conflicts of interest. Maybe we'll just talk about conflicts of interest.
All right, you want to transition us into that?
Let's go into section 2. Let's go into part 2 and talk about conflicts of interest.
Let's get into it.
Because there's some juicy ones here.
There are some big ones. So in our second segment, what we want to do is we want to talk about what conflicts of interest are in the medical and public health research. And figure out how we use information, because conflicts of interest are supposed to be declared. They aren't always, but they are supposed to be declared in medical research. And we have to use that information when we try and determine whether or not these studies were, in fact, valid studies. So, and as we said, 3 of the trials that were included, and there were only, 7 trials total?
7 RCTs.
7 RCTs. That were included. 3 of them were sponsored by industries that would have a stake in this. So that was Nestle, the American Beverage Association, and NutraSweets paid for 3 of these studies. In addition to which they were small studies. I mean,
Do you know who funds the American Beverage Institute, by the way?
Chris Gill?
Coca-Cola.
Oh, shocked. Shocked to learn this. And so the question is, so start us out by just telling us what a conflict of interest is. And then how you deal with when you read an article and there's conflict of interest. What do you do, and what do you just throw up your hands, or do you get any useful information?
Well, I think it's really hard. I think it's a very tough concept, because conflict of interest really exists all over the place. I mean, even individual researchers have conflict of interest when they conduct a particular study. That's why there are data safety and monitoring boards. That's why there are institutional review boards.
What's a data safety and monitoring board?
So that's an external body that evaluates your study and the results of your study and determine whether there has been harm or whether there has been an imbalance in the effect that is so beneficial that you need to stop the study and offer that beneficial effect to the control arm.
And is that done in all studies?
No, not at all studies. It's done in intervention studies.
Done in trials.
In trials,
yeah.
Right. But there's a natural tendency for even the investigators to want everything to go well because everybody's invested in this. So conflict of interest is when you may get additional benefit for a positive trial result, but it's most notably applied when there is financial gain. And we went into this in great depth in one of the other podcasts where we talked about Wakefield and the autism vaccination immunization study where he had as severe a conflict of interest as you could imagine.
Though I would point out that conflict of interest does not necessarily lead to fraud. Conflict of interest often leads to unintentional behavior change.
Right.
So it's not intentional.
It's more subtle.
Yeah.
Right. It's not necessarily bad and it doesn't necessarily need to be prescribed. But what it does need to be is acknowledged so that the consumers of the information can evaluate whether there was an effect. The trouble is that there are times when it actually does have an effect on the outcomes in ways that you don't necessarily see. And if like in this instance, when there are 3 RCTs, small as they were, that were sponsored by one of the manufacturers of the intervention, and they all were beneficial, a red flag has to go up in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, Don. And I think when we say there's a conflict of interest, it has this tremendous pejorative connotation, but it need not be so. It can be subtle. It can be unconscious. I mean, as researchers with a hypothesis that we're trying to test in the randomized controlled trial, we have a vested interest in the outcome. We have a belief in our hypothesis, and so that's why we do placebo and blinding in our randomized controlled trials, because we don't trust ourselves. We recognize we have an internal conflict of interest, and we are guarding against that.
And how does a placebo, which is essentially a sugar pill, and a blinding, which essentially is...
Well, in this case, it would be aspartame, but...
Aspartame, okay, yep.
Yep. I mean, we use a placebo so that we can disentangle the effects of how patients expect an intervention to work, or how doctors expect an intervention to work on their patients when they're measuring this outcome from the actual effects of the treatment under study. Yep. And then we use blinding because we are afraid that if the doctors are expecting to see something, that they will, overcast the good news and undercast the bad news in their enthusiasm. And it need not be with malicious intent. I think it's more just human nature.
Yep.
And I think there's an example of this, a subtle one, possibly in this meta-analysis, because they were reading their discussion, they were a little disappointed with the results because it tended to show that the RCTs were, if anything, better than that showed a slight benefit, which is, I think, not what they wanted to see, because they were reacting to the previous meta-analysis by these guys, Murray, Miller, and Perez. Yep. Now, the interesting thing about this is that since they have a belief that the observational studies may be more oomphy in this case.
Oomphy meaning better?
More believable. They want the observational studies to be correct.
I speak fluent Gill. Don't worry. Oomphy.
They want the observational studies to be correct, and so they downplay the fact that the RCTs were
randomized trials.
The randomized controlled trials showed a positive benefit. But it goes beyond that, because in their selection of the studies, remember this previous meta-analysis had 15 randomized controlled trials. And the second one, which they were doing in response to that, only had 7.
What happened to the other 8?
What happened to the other 8? Now, they cast a wider net in terms of how they sought for these studies, and they found a few more, but they also kicked out a whole lot of randomized controlled trials because they narrowed it down by applying very specific inclusion criteria, which you have to do. But it also eliminated over half of the randomized controlled trials from consideration, and therefore, by definition, gives more weight to the observational studies. Because you've eliminated the competition. I thought it was sort of subtle, but that is in fact what they did.
And it didn't get rid of the underlying problem because they remained very heterogeneous.
And it's still right. They were still heterogeneous, and they still showed a general trend towards being better than sugar.
Are you saying there was a conflict of interest for the reviewer, the people who conducted this meta-analysis?
I'm saying yes. I think there was a subtle doctrinal bias that maybe crept in there in terms of how they decided that they were going to filter out the studies that they were more suspicious of.
So you're saying that they basically, through the methods, cooked the input of the data to come up with the finding that they wanted.
It's subtle. I mean, I think we go a little bit too far. I wouldn't say they cooked the data. I think it's much more subtle than this.
You're wearing your reading into things glasses.
Maybe so. However, on the original meta-analysis, there was a much more overt conflict of interest, which was accompanied by an editorial by this guy James Hill, who basically thumped the table and said, "This meta-analysis, the Miller and Perez one, that
wait, the original one,
Yep. Thumping his table, his hand on the table and saying, this proves that sugar substitutes should be routinely recommended for everybody who wants weight loss, and that the evidence is now unambiguous," which is like, and you're like, whoa, that's quite a strong interpretation.
And you are going to tell me that Mr. Hill has some...
And at the end, and I'll just read his disclosure statement. It says, the author has received grant funding from the American Beverage Association and from the Coca-Cola Company. And we actually know that the American Beverage Association is funded by the Coca-Cola Company. So it's not "and the Coca-Cola Company." It's the Coca-Cola Company and the Coca-Cola Company again. He has also served as a consultant for the Coca-Cola Company, General Mills, and McDonald's.
Potential conflict.
So a pretty interesting conflict of interest, I would say.
This is an example where the concept of transparency may not necessarily mitigate the effect of somebody's very strongly held opinion put forward in a very overt way as an editorial to an RCT. Because in very small print, at the end of the article, we find out that he has this conflict of interest. But how many people are actually going to read that small print at the end of the article? And a lot of people are just going to read the title or say, "Oh, wow, that editorial really was supportive of this, so it must be a great study."
There you go.
And so would you say then that if it's sponsored by industry, we just disregard it, we throw it out?
No, of course not. But it's tricky, And when you're trying to find an editorialist to talk about an article, you have to be very careful because this is where people, it's like reading the abstract. People often only read the editorial or only read the abstract of the paper. They won't read the fine print.
So I was not specifically referring to the editorial. I was referring to the original studies. So you've got 3 of the 7 randomized trials that were done in the meta-analysis were sponsored by industry. Would you just chuck those out? Do you put any weight into them?
No, I would put a big question mark next to each of them and say, these are studies, and then you would look at them, you probably want to pull the papers and say, were they blinded? Was it double blind? Were the observers blinded as well as the participants?
They were. I can tell you there was not a lot of blinding going on. It's very hard to blind some. As you point out, you can taste the difference between aspartame and sugar, which makes it very difficult to blind people as to whether or not they were taking aspartame.
Almost sounds like a marketing jingle, doesn't it?
It's writes itself, doesn't it? Now, hang on. So if that's the case, then why do we let industry sponsor studies at all? Why don't we just say journals aren't going to publish any industry-sponsored studies?
Well, it presupposes that we have any say in the matter.
I
assume that the 3 of us here make the rules. Is that not true?
Yeah, I mean, who's gonna enforce that? It's not going to be the FDA. It's not going to be the Institute of Medicine.
The journals.
The journals could get together and do that, I suppose. But probably there's a fair amount of research that results in publications that they want to publish. So it would be it would be to a certain extent decreasing the amount of papers that they could publish.
Yeah,
and so that's sort of choking off their.
You're saying they have a conflict of interest.
They have a vested interest in having as much science produced as possible, and industry does support a lot of scientific research.
And also publication of scientific journals.
If in fact we're all just going to disregard it, then is that money well spent? Is that useful? I'm not saying I'm not saying that I do throw things out simply because it's a industry sponsored trial or because what if it's a trial that is run by a university but the funding comes from the industry?
That would provide a little bit of space, and you might say, okay, the conflict of interest has been one step removed, and yet it is not completely removed.
It's not completely removed. In fact, I think to the average person, they would see that as no different. That where is this researcher getting their money from? Therefore, they have a vested interest to see the results make their funder happy, so they can get more funding. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that is the case, but I am saying in subtle ways that probably, invades the discipline.
Yeah.
And it's a slippery slope. We all know from the conflict of interest forms that we have to fill out when we do any kind of publication or get any kind of research dollars. There are gradations of support that they can give you. They can just give you cash money and turn around and never be involved in the study. They can help you design it. They can help you write it. I mean, there are a whole different number of ways that industry can very slyly affect the outcome of the study, right? Or the spin of the outcome of the study.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but they can even design the study, run the study, analyze the study, and write the study and put your name on it.
Right.
That has been known.
Yeah.
Hopefully that is happening less and less.
Hopefully.
Oof. That's pretty upsetting. Have any of you had to declare conflicts of interest ever in your research?
Yes. So I recently wrote a paper that, talked about the sad fate of the meningitis vaccine I worked on. And because I was working for Pharma at the time and had an absolute conflict of interest, I declared that, I don't have any stocks, but, I could not say I was disinterested. I took it very personally.
Yeah.
So, I was upfront about that.
Don, you?
No, I've never gotten any kind of industry money. So even though I fill out those damned conflict of interest forms all the time, I've never declared a conflict of interest.
How about you, Matt?
No, none at all. But I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, did I forget to declare something? I think that's just my
baseline paranoia.
Checked your mutual funds lately?
I have not. What do you think's in there? Oh boy,
tobacco money, gun money.
I hope
it's all
not.
in there.
I really hope I'm not supporting those things. Pharmaceuticals I can live with. Other things I'm not sure I can.
Maybe we could get these podcasts sponsored.
Ooh, got any thoughts? Who's the obvious sponsor for this?
The Donald J. Trump Foundation.
Oh, good Lord.
Oh, please.
I would just assume pack it up. Oh.
No, I would pack it up.
Yeah, well, you're looking for a reason to get out from day one, so there's an easy one for you.
So, conflicts of interest? We're for them or against them?
I can say, it's hard to say. I think we're against them.
Okay.
I think in summary,
How
we're
can you be
against them.
for them?
It was a little elliptical.
I think it was. All right. Well, let's move on then to our third and final segment, our favorite of the podcast, our amazing and amusing. Here we want to highlight some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. So, Don, you want to start us off with what is the amazing and amusing, but you refer to as the wacky science? You want to give us some wacky science?
I think this is wacky science.
It always is.
So I've got an article that I found that falls into the category of why did they do this study?
Oh, yeah.
And how is this actually going to be helpful in terms of improving world health or pushing back the boundaries of ignorance? Nonetheless, I found the results really interesting. So it's a paper published by Yang, Pham, Chu, and Hu in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very good journal. Yeah. And the title of it is Duration of Urination Does Not Change with Body Size. So what these investigators wanted to know was whether there is variation in the duration of urination in mammals based on their body size.
Oh, mammals.
Mammals.
All mammals? People included in mammals?
Absolutely. They stratified it into mammals that are less than 3 kilograms and mammals that are over 3 kilograms.
There's no radio way to show the way that Chris is looking at you right now.
Yeah.
I think you're squinting, scowling. In any event, so what they did is they did high-speed videos of a whole series of animals urinating. 16 animals were observed urinating at a local zoo, and they got 28 videos off of YouTube of animals urinating and did a whole analysis of this.
I see a bias problem.
And they came to the conclusion that all mammals urinate when they have a full bladder. They all urinate for more or less 21 seconds.
No, I don't buy that.
Regardless.
That cannot be the case.
That is apparently invariable across a factor of 3,600 times difference in the volume of the bladder. So when you compare the duration of urination for a house cat and an elephant, more or less the duration is the same.
Okay. Can I just start with the fact that I am so disturbed there are that many videos on YouTube that you could use for this study?
I know.
And second of all, I would venture to guess most of them are cats.
No, not at all. Not at all.
The internet is just a vehicle to watch cat videos.
My favorite part of this article are the acknowledgments.
Oh boy.
Because they acknowledge every YouTube contributor to their study,
kidding.
including Demon Dragon 115, Crazy Boy 35.
Yep.
And then the only other thing I want to say is that this paper, this project was supported by a National Science Foundation faculty early career development program.
Very nice. We learned a lot from that.
Wow.
That is
21
important.
seconds, actually plus or minus 13 seconds.
I am going to time myself from now on.
Standard deviation, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Well,
It's a deviant standard.
That is
gosh.
concerning. All right, Chris, what do you got for us?
I'm just wondering whether demon dragons are mammals.
No, that was the moniker for the YouTube person.
Oh, was it? Okay, well, you've got me beat, Matt, Don. I can't come close to that. But,
who
I
can?
did try. This is a shout out to all the chiropterologists out there who listen to our show.
The Kai what?
The chiropterologists, the people who study bats.
Oh, okay.
And I thought
Bats
I would,
are so cool.
they are cool, and I thought I would also subtitle this the Rosettus stone. Rosettus being a genus of bat, the Egyptian fruit bat to be precise.
There is exactly one person out there who knows what you're talking about, and since we only have 2 listeners, they are not one of them.
So it's either a vampire or Batman.
There you go. There you go.
On the web today trying to find a cool article to do for our funny science, and I saw this great video.
Amazing and amusing.
Wacky
Why won't you
science.
call
Wacky Science. I think it was amazing and amusing. It was either on
running a
PNAS
daycare.
or it was on Science. I can't remember, but it was a video of bats crashing into
Wait a minute.
aluminum plates that had been hung up in various places to prove that the bat echolocation process requires a rough surface, that if it's a very smooth surface, they whack into it like a mirror. They can't because the
that's
sound
cool.
has to be able to back by.
They set that up as an experiment?
Yeah,
That's
and
really cruel.
They put
That
them
is
in houses and caves, and also like
mean.
in the trees near their caves. And the bats would go whacking into them every time. They can't see them
That
using
is not
echolocation.
cool.
Oh, I think Patton needs to get after those guys.
The sound,
That's not
instead
cool.
of like hitting a roughage and bouncing back, it just deflects. Anyway.
That's not the study you brought.
That's not the study I brought. The study I brought was about a redesignation of the phylogeny of big bats and little bats in regards to their echolocation. Now, previously, the world of bats had been split into the Megachiroptera, the big bats, which are like flying
Do you
foxes.
have any idea what he's talking about?
No idea.
And the Microchiroptera, which are like all the other bats that you see. And the Microchiroptera universally have echolocation, and the Megachiroptera almost always do not, with one exception, which is the Rosettus bat, the Egyptian fruit bat.
Are they also blind, the big ones?
No, they have excellent eyesight, in fact, and they tend to hunt at dusk, and
So
they
we
eat
can't
fruit.
say blind as a bat anymore.
They're not blind. They have excellent eyesight, and they find their fruit trees and they eat them by visual identification. Now, the issue for the bat people is where did echolocation disappear in the evolution of bats? Because you've got the Megachiroptera, the fruit bats, and the flying foxes, who do not have echolocation, except for this one, the Rosettus bat, which does.
Yes.
But the way that the Rosettus bat has echolocation is fundamentally different from the way that all of the Microchiroptera bats do. So the Microchiropteran bats create their click sounds by making sort of like sounds in their throats. It's a laryngeal click, whereas the Rosettus bat makes clicking sounds with its tongue, like that. So it's a totally different mechanism of making high-pitched noises, which evolutionary suggests that this was a reacquisition of echolocation as a second way to acquire echolocation, that these are genetically very different pathways, but they both reach the same endpoint. But then they did all these molecular analyses looking at the DNA, and they found that there's this species of bat in the Microchiroptera, the clicky bats, that has a weak echolocation. That also comes from the larynx. That means like sounds in the back of its throat. But genetically is closer aligned to the Megachiroptera and should be in that family, meaning that we now have a third pathway to echolocation. Or that this, which is called the what is the name of this? It's the horseshoe bat.
Horseshoe bat.
Because it's got this curious apparatus on its nose that looks like a series of like chicken combs that it uses to direct its clicks. And it has a much inferior way of generating its echolocation compared with a microchiroptera, but genetically it's closer to the megachiroptera. And so it looks like this may be like either
the missing link.
A second reacquisition of echolocation on the mega side, or that this is on the pathway to losing its echolocation because it's a fruit bat and actually doesn't need to see at night because it's not hunting for insects. And I thought this was really interesting.
Fascinating.
Wow.
Well done. I like it.
Bats, they're so cool.
Gonna have you explain that to me again after the show.
Yeah, have you ever read about all the pathogens that are generated in bats because of their body temperature?
No.
What?
Yeah.
They're like
we can talk about that next time. No, but the number of odd pathogens like Ebola and Lassa fever and all the rest of that come from bats
is because of their body temperature.
In part because of their body temperature, yeah.
And in fact, it's the Rosetta spat that's implicated as the Ebola vector.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
The Egyptian fruit bat.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I think all I want to say is both of you have been so true to your natures and what you brought in, and I'm going to do the exact same because, as you guys know, I love
statues, right?
I love Easter eggs in writing. So I love when people just throw in weird stuff into their scientific publications, and so this one, it's a really short one. It comes from the Princeton professor Harry Frankfurt, who wrote the book on, I'm not allowed to say the word, so we'll just say on BS.
No, BS. What is BS?
BS is a term that people sometimes use for baloney, or I think the term was malarkey, was thrown around. You know what I'm referring to.
It's not nearly as satisfying to say,
no, it is
however.
Not. All right.
It just doesn't have the same punch.
I tell you what, when this is over, I'm going to let you say it over and over and over until you get out of your system. And so he wrote this really wonderful book on BS, which begins, one of the most salient features of our culture is that there is so much BS. Everyone knows this. Each of us contributes a share, but we tend to take the situation for granted. And then he writes this whole long book about the story of BS and why we use it and all those things. But the very first page of it contains this sentence. Even the most basic and preliminary questions about BS remain, after all, not only unanswered, but unasked. So far as I am aware, very little work has been done on the subject. I have not undertaken a survey of the literature, partly because I do not know how to go about it. I just love
Oh, that sounds like BS.
I just love the honesty.
That's excellent.
I just love it. Well, that is the end of our program. If you have any feedback on this or any other episodes, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at PopHealthEX. That's at PopHealthEX. So we've got some really great news for the podcast fans. We've now hit just about 1,000 downloads, and we are looking to expand the podcast. And to do that, we want to get your feedback. So we have set up a survey that you can find on our webpage. So go to pophealthyex.org/FA, or just go to our page on the pophealthyex.org website. And we're hoping that we can get some feedback so that we can really build the podcast and make it better to respond to the issues and things that you all are really interested in. We want to thank Leslie Talian, Director of Lifelong Learning at Boston University School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you download the next episode.